To recap, just generally about the webinar program, every month we'll be featuring a live webinar bringing in highly ambitious and successful members of our Gen2 community. So thank you, Oliver, for agreeing to speak with us today. And our goal is to just discuss a very broad range of topics, ranging from culture, politics, to professional spaces. Our main goal with this series is to create a space where students and young professionals can hear from their peers with similar backgrounds or maybe very different backgrounds and very different careers, and just learn about real world insights. So, particularly, we're focusing on topics that go beyond the classroom and are very unique to the experiences of Chinese Americans. Before we dive in, I would like to quickly introduce our speakers and moderators, who are coincidentally our webinar team. I can start. My name is Tatiana, and I'm acting as the Director of Professional and Educational Programs for TYCon. I'm a junior studying public and international affairs at Princeton, and I'll be helping moderate today's discussion and guiding us through the conversation.
Hi everyone, my name is Raymond. I'm currently the Southern California Regional Lead and also webinar team member. I'm currently a sophomore at UCI studying electrical engineering. I also met Oliver personally at one of his fundraisers for his campaign in November.
Hello, everyone. My name is Remy Rong. I am the content lead for TYCon. I'm a marketing student at Penn State, and I serve in the U.S. Army National Guard as a medical readiness officer at my unit. I am especially excited for today's conversation because of my service and my academic background. I'm personally interested in leadership, public service, and how individuals step into roles that impact their communities at scale. I'll pass the mic back to Raymond as he will introduce our special guest for this month's webinar.
So as everyone knows, our special guest is Oliver Ma. He's a candidate for Lieutenant Governor of California in the 2026 election cycle. He's also a civil rights lawyer who graduated from Harvard Law School. His experiences growing up as a Gen 2 in the US will be very relatable, and his advice is very valuable to many of us in the audience today. So welcome, Oliver, and thank you for making time to come on and share your story.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I apologize for joining from my car. This is a big state, and I'm realizing that a lot of the times we're on the road. But yeah, thanks so much for having me. My mom graduated from Tsinghua in, I think, 89. Very eventful year in Beijing, as you might know. I grew up, spent 7 years in China in Beijing, grew up in the US, in Orange County, and then went to Berkeley for undergrad, went to Harvard for law school, worked for a few years at the ACLU as a civil rights lawyer, and now I'm running for California Lieutenant Governor. It's so great to be in community with you all. And yeah, let me know what questions folks have.
All right, before we continue, we would like to do a quick disclaimer. So I like to know that TYCon is a nonpartisan, apolitical organization. Our mission is to create a space for thoughtful dialogue by highlighting a wide range of voices and perspectives. We're committed to facilitating open, respectful conversation, especially in today's polarized climate. The views expressed during this event are those of the speaker and do not represent endorsements or official positions of TYCon, and we encourage everyone to engage with curiosity, critical thinking, and respect.
Okay. Thank you for that disclaimer, Raymond. I'd just like to quickly go over our agenda for today. We're going to be moderating for about 20-25 minutes of discussion, talking about Oliver's early life, undergrad, law school, and then moving to more recent years in the campaign. And then after that moderated section, then we'll open it up to you all, the guests. Thank you for joining, to ask any questions you may have. So without further ado, I think we can stop sharing the screen and get started with the conversation. Fantastic. Okay, so we'd love to start at the beginning. Obviously, you said you grew up a little bit in China and then you moved to California, but I would like to hear more about your childhood. What was your family background and story like?
Yeah, so I lived in Beijing until I was 7, and some of the really formative memories of me is for me is growing up in my grandma's apartment building, which was 24 stories tall, so incredibly tall in Beijing. And so my grandma makes really good dumplings, and she still does. And sometimes we wouldn't be able to finish our dumplings, so I would take some and try to drop them on people who were walking down 24 stories below us. And my grandma never knew that I was doing this. I always would tell her I ate the dumplings. But one time she came up and she was like, "Oliver, you need to stop with this." And I was like, "How do you know? It was me. I didn't do anything." And she was like, "You've been throwing dumplings at people because the police have put up a poster that says whoever is doing this is going to get in a lot of trouble. I was like, no way, you're bullshitting me. So she drags me downstairs to the first story. And at the entrance, the police did indeed post, hey, whoever's doing this needs to stop because it could really hurt people. I've since changed. I know that that might make people question who they vote for in June, but I have since changed. Growing up in the US, then when I was in middle school, that same grandma was profiled and taken by federal agents. At that time, she had a visa to be in the US, so she was here legally, but she didn't speak any English. And because she was unable to explain herself, they took her. And my parents didn't really speak English. And so, really, it was me and my sister who were filling out forms and making phone calls, getting her in touch with an attorney, paying bail, all of these things. And obviously a really tough time for my family, but eventually we were able to get her out. That's why I went to law school. That's why I became a civil rights lawyer. And that's also why I'm running for office, because now my grandma is 90 years old. She still loves going on her morning walks. She still makes great dumplings, and she still doesn't speak any English. And I'm really scared that these federal agents that are going around everywhere on roving patrol, just grabbing people for having brown skin, that they're going to see her one morning and take her again.
Yeah, wait, that's a very powerful story. Thank you for sharing. And I think that'll help guide a lot of the rest of our conversation about, why you got into service and law. On a more lighthearted note, before we carry on, though, I would like to know if you had any hobbies and interests besides dropping dumplings on people's heads growing up, maybe when you came to the US.
Yeah, so I grew up playing swimming and playing water polo. Water polo is still a sport I really enjoy. I'll sometimes coach. The last team I coached was a team of 10 and under. It definitely felt like herding cats because their attention span is so short. You'll tell one
Yeah.
person to go there, and five people are like, "Wait, me?" And then they all start going there, and then the person you want to go there is like floating away. But I really enjoyed that. I also really enjoy reading and writing. Yeah, some pretty common hobbies, I think, for someone growing up in Southern California.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Oliver also has some questions. So obviously you grew up in China, but when you moved to the US, did you still feel like a strong connection to your Chinese identity? Like, did you still like write Chinese every day? Did you still like practice speaking? Did you do any of that?
Once I moved to the US, I didn't go to like Chinese school or anything, but my parents always spoke Mandarin to me at home. And so I'm still pretty fluent. I really struggle with physically writing with my hand Chinese characters because Chinese characters are really hard to write for me. But pinyin makes things a lot easier. But in terms of my Chinese heritage, that is something that has really been a question that I asked myself over time, right? I'm sure a lot of folks here felt sometimes that they didn't belong in the US, that they're not real Americans. And for me, growing up, a lot of the times I internalized that and blamed myself for that. And it was only until I got to college that I really saw that, hey, so many other people from so many other communities have felt the same thing. And it is not my fault. It is not the Chinese community's fault. It is the fault of this system, this structural racist system that we live in. But I'll just share, right? When I got into Harvard for law school, they notify you by phone. And when I got that phone call, the whole first day, what I felt was not excitement or pride. What I felt was safety. Because I thought if I go to this school that is older than the US, then no one's ever going to be able to say I don't belong here. Right? I will finally be a real American. And so then I finished law school, I become an attorney. And there was one time where I have to go into one of these for-profit ICE prisons to speak to my client. And for our clients, when they speak to an attorney, it is absolutely critical because in that particular case, my client was supposed to go in front of a judge the next day. And if he gets to stay in this country with his family, with his kids, or if he gets banished from the US for 10 years. And so for him, obviously, it's critical that he does good when he goes in front of a judge, and it's critical that I be able to meet with him and prepare him. But when I get to the detention center, they won't let me in. And the reason they won't let me in is because they saw I was born in China. They assume I'm not a US citizen, and they demand to see my A number, my alien number. And I tell them I don't have an A number, like I'm a citizen. Here's my state bar number. I'm a licensed attorney in the state of California. I need to go speak to my client. And they still won't let me in. And I just remember sitting there thinking, like, I am a Harvard trained attorney. I work at the ACLU, the best civil rights law firm in the country. And for these people, I still don't belong. For these people, I will still never be truly American. And I think that's why what TYCon is doing here is so important. That's why all the organizing in our community is so important, because I think the future of Chinese Americans in our country is really scary, as Democrats and Republicans don't agree on many things, but the one thing they agree on is China is our enemy. And so I think we really risk being seen as the enemy, being seen as spies. And so I think us organizing our communities, going into politics, fighting for justice, speaking up for other communities when they are under attack, all of these things are really important to do right now.
Yeah, well said. I definitely do agree with that. I mean, I'm sure all of us have struggled with that sense of belonging. Based on your story, you did say your grandma had a profound impact on you at an early stage, but who were like the other mentors and role models that you looked up to when you had that sense of like not belonging?
I had some teachers that were really excellent, and some coaches, some older water polo players on my teams that were really important. I think what my mentors over time have taught me is you cannot idolize people. You can't look up to everything about someone, right? Because, I had coaches who really taught me discipline, but at the same time, like, had some misogyny in them, or are not the kind of man, and the kind of like bring the kind of masculine energy that I try to bring today to my community. And at the same time, I had teachers who maybe I look up to for certain things, but not for other things. So I think treating people as humans and not expecting them to be perfect, seeing the nuances in what they teach you, that's been a really formative experience for me.
Yeah, I definitely agree that like it's okay to have mentors and people that you look up to, but it's not right to idolize. I do also have similar experiences where when I played ice hockey, I was oftentimes always the only Asian person on the
Mm.
team. And I felt like, okay, I needed to prove that, oh, I'm as good as you guys, I belong on the team. And the coaches were, I always had I was pretty lucky. Most of my coaches were very hardworking and they told me like all these really good things. But then again, they also had a bad side, especially in high school when I realized, okay, they could be a very good ice hockey coach, but that doesn't mean they're a very good person off the ice. But yeah, I guess we'll transition next to Tatiana, who will go to the UC Berkeley section. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you talked already a little about your work at ACLU, but I'd like to backtrack a little bit for those of us who are college age or maybe high school age on the call. You attended obviously UC Berkeley for your undergraduate studies. Obviously, a lot of your upbringing formed and helped inform what you wanted to study, but were there any experiences in college that really solidified your passion for like public service, or maybe clubs you were a part of, or how did you really decide what to study?
Yeah. I think the biggest, most formative experience was in college. I started a nonprofit organization called Asian Youth Liberty League, Ally, whose mission it is to train Asian youth to fight for racial justice. And that is where I first got a lot of my community organizing experience. The club it's a nonprofit. It's completely run by students, by high school students. So we have 8 chapters around the country. And yeah, it's high school students who are managing everything from inviting in speakers to promoting the events to hosting fundraisers to hiring interns. And my job and the job of the board of that organization is to teach them and to elevate them. And I think what I really learned is, for example, the importance of like not micromanaging and actually challenging, empowering the high school students to grow as leaders and to really blossom into the kind of leader that they are. In Berkeley, I also met a lot of folks from different communities. I had friends who lived out of their cars in college. And when you're living out of your car, you're not able to study as well, obviously. And so that's something that's a huge priority for me now, is making our public universities tuition free, making housing more affordable for students. And another experience that I was just reflecting on recently was there was this man who worked at a gas station right next to my house called Ken. In 4 years of living there, like I never interacted with him that much. But my senior year of college, one time I was walking home from class when I walked by this gas station and I see Ken walking. And he was carrying so much stuff with him, like bags and bags, backpacks. Like he was completely covered with his stuff. And he also had a limp. And so it was very painful for him to walk. He was maybe like, it felt like he was dragging his legs with him, like turning his body to
Yeah.
drag his leg with all the stuff he was carrying. And he was walking maybe like, it took him like 10 minutes to walk a single block. And so I go and I help him with some of his stuff. I walk him home. And his home is only about 3 blocks away. And he lived in a tent that was pitched on a sidewalk. And so the
Mhm.
reason he was carrying all of that stuff is because he was afraid if he left his stuff in his tent, it would get taken during the day when he was working. And because of his, how much stuff he was carrying, because of his disability, it took him like an hour to walk to and from work every day. And so from that point on, like whenever I saw him walking, like I would help him carry his stuff, walk with him, and that would make his walk a lot shorter. But I walked by where his tent usually is, and there was a notice from the city that said his tent had been swept. They had taken his stuff. And I know that he probably lost so many things when they took his stuff. He probably lost his ID, like his medication, if he had any memories of his loved ones, pictures, etc. And actually, after that day, he stopped working at the gas station. I never saw Ken again. And for me, it really shows the devastating impact that public policy can have on individual people's lives. In the state of
Yeah.
California, we do a lot of these encampment sweeps, and people often lose everything, right? All of their belongings that Ken was carrying with him, their medication, their personal ID, memories, like all of these things they lose. And that's something that I think is fundamentally wrong. And I think we need to treat all of our communities with dignity.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really powerful story. Do you think that this experience is one of the primary things that motivated you to pursue law?
Yes, yes. At that point, I had actually just gotten into law school, and I was deciding like, what do I want to do
Okay.
with my legal degree? And I think
Yeah.
that really solidified me that I want to use my career to uplift communities and empower communities and go into public interest and help people like Ken instead of going into corporate law.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm also curious a little bit, like day to day, what does a typical day look like as a civil rights lawyer for you? Just to, like take away some of the fog for us.
Yeah, it's fun. I really enjoy being the kind of attorney I am. In the legal world, there's a lot of different things that lawyers do, right? You could do in court advocacy, go in front of a judge every single day. You could do a lot of legal research and writing, or you could do a lot of community organizing. For me as a civil rights attorney, I probably did 50% of my time legal research and writing, 50% of my time organizing my communities, and like 1% of my time in front of a judge. And that's really great for me. I think attorneys have a tendency of helicoptering into communities and saying, I have a law degree, I'm going to fix everything.
Yeah.
And then because they don't have roots in that community, because they don't really understand that community, they end up causing a lot of harm. And I always want to avoid doing that. And I think the ACLU is a really good example of an organization that avoids doing that because the kind of change the law brings is not very sustainable. Or you could win a court case and it could just get reversed like that with the snap
Yeah.
of a finger by a judge. And when communities focus too much on making change through the law, then you're neglecting the things that actually stick around, which is the grassroots organizing, training leaders, changing people's hearts and minds, right? If you change the way people think about immigrants, that is way longer lasting. And that will keep our communities way more safe than focusing all your energy on changing the way one judge thinks about immigrants. And I think in the law, we focus too much on that one judge and not on changing people's hearts and minds in the community. And so the kind of lawyering I really enjoy doing is using my legal skills to build community power. So what that means is, if I were organizing a tenants union, right, like I did in law school, because the conditions in that building are so bad, the landlord will often retaliate by trying to evict the tenant leader, whoever is organizing this tenants union. And so us as attorneys, where we can make a huge difference is representing that tenant leader so the tenant union can keep organizing. Right. What we do today, right? Yes, I filed lawsuits. I went up in front of the Supreme Court, one of my lawsuits. But what is much more meaningful is when I'm able to use my legal skills to elevate leaders. Right now, what I'm doing is I spend a lot of time with my county's rapid response network. I train people to be legal observers. I train people to be rapid responders. So these people can actually go into the community and protect people.
Yeah.
That's the kind of change we need to focus on.
Yeah, no, I think that point is really important about just because, like some lawyers just try to come in and change the law. It doesn't really change the community fundamentally. I think Remy might have a very interesting perspective on this because, in military, I think leadership means often something different. So I would love to pass it along and see, what kind of questions can come up.
Yeah, so in the military, leadership often means making decisions with incomplete information and also high stakes. So in law and public service, have you faced similar moments where you had to make difficult decisions under pressure, and how do you navigate that?
Good question. Definitely yes. I think there is less like immediate decision making. In the law, you get to consult with a lot of clients and a lot of communities and a lot of other attorneys in making decisions. There's very few things that you have to do a split second decision of, and then that's the way it is. I think, in a way, that is a critique of our legal system, which is lawyers are very risk averse. We would rather not act and not do the right thing if it means we also get to avoid doing the wrong thing. We always try to avoid taking risks. And I think that's a problem because that means a lot of communities don't really get the change they need. As an attorney, we really, really limit the stories we tell to the public. And there are a lot of stories that we encounter or develop through our lawsuits that would be very good at changing people's hearts and minds that we don't tell because we are so risk averse. Where I do make a lot more split second decisions is doing the community organizing or now as a candidate for office. When I meet with my clients who are in detention centers, when I'm legal observing at protests, right? I've legal observed some protests where the police comes and they try to shut things down, right? They're very intimidating. They pull out their weapons and they say, get out. And standing between the protesters that I'm trying to protect and the cops, that is a very exhilarating moment because these it's 4 or 5 cops heavily armed, heavily armored with like machine guns, and you're the only thing standing between them and these protesters who are fighting for something important. And trusting yourself, trusting your legal knowledge, and standing up and not backing down to protect this event, protect the Constitution, protect the First Amendment. That definitely takes some split second decision making, but it's worth it.
So at what point did you move from serving within the system as a lawyer to decided you wanted to shape the system as a policymaker?
It was last year. The very first immigration raid in the country was in Bakersfield, where I work. They came in January last year and rounded up hundreds of farm workers. And so we file our lawsuits and we actually win. We won an injunction in federal court against the Trump administration. And so a federal judge ordered this administration to stop further illegal raids throughout the entire Central Valley of California, protected about 10 million people from further immigration raids. But what was very noticeable to me was the Trump administration didn't care. For them, an order from a federal judge was like a sheet of paper. And they kept the raids going. And it really showed me that some of these traditional guardrails of our democracy are no longer there. And instead of making change through the court system, the state of California has to step up. And the state of California can do a lot more to protect our communities. And that's a big reason I'm running.
Thank you, Oliver. I do see that we have some questions. I will say we're gonna go over one final topic really quickly, and then we will open it up to the audience for questions. But the final thing I would like to shift to is like ways for the younger generations to get involved. You mentioned you started this Asian Youth Liberty League. There's also organizations like United Chinese Americans. Could you share just a little bit about these organizations and what opportunities they provide for us?
Yeah, so Asian Youth Liberty League, that's the nonprofit I started that trains Asian youth to fight for racial justice. As high schoolers, you can join one of our chapters, and it would be your job to help organize some of these events. We invite in elected officials, we organize debates among candidates, we have workshops where people can work on public speaking, speech and
Mhm.
debate, stuff like that. And so that's a really great opportunity. We also hire interns. And so if you're in college, then apply to one of the Allies internships. I think it's a really great experience. Very few interns are able to do what our interns in Ally are able to do. We really like to treat our interns as if they're running a nonprofit organization because they're basically supervising 2 college chapters or 2 high school chapters. So, they're working with 8 to 10 high school students, organizing dozens of events, organizing fundraising. So it's really good experience. UCA, that's an organization that has supported me and mentored me for a long time. Really respect the work they do. I think, like I told you earlier, I think our community is really under risk in the future. And one thing UC has been doing for a decade is defending our civil rights, defending the right of Chinese people to not just feel safe, but also to prosper in the US. As you might know, there's been a bunch of laws recently that bans Chinese people from buying property in states. It's happened in Texas, it's happened in Florida, and I think it also was considered in Ohio. And UCA was absolutely critical in coordinating lawsuits, in coordinating community organizing, victories in the elections to stop these laws.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. And just one final question. As Asian Americans are obviously historically pretty underrepresented in policy spaces, do you have any final pieces of advice for second gen Chinese Americans to help break that mold? I know it's a big question, but anything that you would tell younger you?
I would tell younger me and the folks out here that yes, we need to get more involved, but the path that has been trailblazed by those who came before us is absolutely there. It is very well paved and it is very wide. I have, since launching, I have seen how much groundwork folks like UCA, folks like Apapa, all the leaders who came before us
Yeah.
have done for us. Like I feel so supported, I feel so mentored, I feel so connected to the community. You know, there are other communities that I am a member of, right? I speak Spanish.
Yeah.
I work in a predominantly Spanish speaking community. I'm really involved in protecting folks who are speaking up for Palestine. I'm a union member. So there's a bunch of communities that I'm a part of, but absolutely the Chinese American, the Asian American community is the most well organized and the most solidly behind me.
Wait, that is honestly really reassuring and positive to hear. Thank you. Thank you. I think now we can transition to some questions from the audience. I know some people have been raising their hands.
I think we can start with Jason. I think you can unmute and ask Oliver your question.
Hello.
Hi, Jason.
Well, thank you very much for hosting the session. And I'm Jason Xu. I'm the president of Silicon Valley Chinese Association. So, quick question for Oliver. And I heard your news story and I heard your activity. So, and I see so many young folks on the session, which is great. We seldomly see many young interested in involving American politics. So that's a good start. So one of the things I always say is a lot of issues always have two sides. And I heard one side, but I do want to hear your opinion regarding education because you have discussed the systemic discrimination in the US system. One of them is education enrollment, college enrollment for the Asian kids. And I think that's obviously a systemic discrimination. It's also related to your job that you are running for, because if you become the lieutenant governor, you will be sitting on the UC board and making decisions. And UC, our organization has in existence for 10 years. Every year at this point, we got a lot of membership complaint about their excellent kid and they are rejected by all the UCs, UCLA, UC Berkeley, and all the way to UC Merced. So that's an obvious issue there. And the other issue related to this is we have been supporting the Harvard lawsuit through the SFFA, but the Supreme Court has rendered a judgment in 2023, June 28th, that Harvard violates the Asian students' constitutional rights for fair treatment. My first question is, what's your opinion on the Harvard lawsuit? Which side are you on? And if you were elected, what do you plan to move UC to enroll students irregardless of their skin color instead of treating people by using classified students based on their skin color, which they have no way to change because it's just born their heritage, right? So those are the two questions. Harvard opinion on the Harvard and how do you plan to change UC for?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I have a very nuanced answer, but I think that's what you all deserve when it comes to affirmative action. Here's the types of affirmative action that I don't support. I do not support schools setting quotas, right? I don't think schools should say, we will take 40 people who are white, 30 people who are Asian, 30 people who are black, et cetera, because I think that doesn't allow schools to think of people as individuals. It only looks at people at skin color. I also don't support schools adding or subtracting points from someone just because of their skin color, right? I don't think schools should say this person is white and so we're gonna add 5 points. This person is Asian, we're gonna subtract 5 points. That's also discrimination. What was very troubling from the Harvard lawsuit, I was at Harvard when that lawsuit was being litigated, was they showed the personality score that Harvard gave to applicants, and Asians were the lowest, lower than every other race. And I think that's a clear example of discrimination, where they looked at Asians and they automatically saw that Asians are not leaders, or they automatically just thought, hey, these people have bad personalities, right? So that I'm against. What I do support is schools being allowed to look at race as a part of a holistic process. And the reason I support that is because race was part of the reason I got into Harvard. When I wrote my admissions essay to Harvard University, I talked about the discrimination I felt, my journey as an immigrant, as a Chinese immigrant coming to the US. I talked about starting Asian Youth Liberty League to fight for racial justice in the US. That was my application. That was my essay. And that was the essay that got me into Harvard Law School. To tell this university that they cannot read my essay because I talk about my race and how race impacted me as an individual would both hurt the university, because they would not let the university consider such an important thing to people, but it would also hurt me, and it would hurt my community, because absolutely, as everyone have talked about today, our upbringing as Chinese Americans, our upbringing as immigrants, our status as people of color who often feel like we don't belong in this country, that is absolutely a part of who we are and a part of what makes us strong. And I think we should be allowed to talk about that in our applications, and I think schools should be able to consider that. So it's very nuanced. There are some types of affirmative action I don't support and some I do support. I don't agree with what Harvard did with their admissions.
So you support the Supreme Court decision because that's what basically Supreme Court is saying, because you cannot use quota and they allow the talk about the race in the essay. That's exactly what you are for, right? And then you support the Supreme Court decision of 2023?
The 2023 decision to me reads like that. What it to me reads is it doesn't allow quotas. It doesn't allow people to subtract or add points based on race. What it does allow is race as part of a holistic process. And so, yes, I support that.
You support the Harvard decision then? Okay,
yes.
Gotcha. So second part of the question is, if you were elected, what do you plan to push UC to make enrollment more colorless?
Well, right now by law, the UCs are not allowed to consider race. And, sometimes
There's an implied system there.
Sometimes the law is on the books and people don't follow that. And I think the UC should follow the law. I do think, though, that the UC should be allowed to consider race as part of a holistic process. Right now, by law, they are not allowed to. I think you and I both think they are somewhat doing that. So, yeah, I think any university should be allowed to consider race as part of a holistic process. That's not currently allowed at the UCs. I think it should be allowed.
If you look at the enrollment numbers, and I think there's an implied practice there. And so do you support litigation against UC to open their books?
I do. I think, as an attorney, all I did was sue government entities who do not want transparency, right? So I know there's a lawsuit currently against the UCs that someone, I think in Silicon Valley, has filed. I met the gentleman a few months ago.
Yeah, Nan, right?
Yeah.
You met Nan? Okay.
I did, yeah.
Right. Right now, I'm sitting on the board of SARD, which is another lawsuit filed in Irvine, California. So this is more coming from UCLA professor Richard Sender group. So if you are supporting, just come looking for us. We can talk about this.
Thank you, Jason. Yep, I support governments providing more transparency. I want to see how the UCs are making these decisions, whether it is the kind that Harvard did, where it discriminated against Asian Americans, or the kind that I support, which is using race as part of a holistic process. So, but I think for us to know that, the UCs need to provide transparency.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you so much for your question, Jason. I do want to be mindful of time and make sure that other people can ask questions. I think we'll go to Ellen and then Megan for the questions.
Hi, my name's Ellen, and I'm a college student, but I'm also running for Madison City Council. My area is like demographically quite different. It's very predominantly white, and I think that my background as a Chinese American really informs my political understanding. So my question is, how do you account for, I guess, like keeping the nuance and speaking to your identity without maybe alienating different audiences?
Yes, California is very diverse, and so I probably have a different community to speak to. What I find to be really helpful is finding the areas where struggles are common, right? Right now, something I work a lot on is protecting the communities that are currently being attacked by ICE. And many of those people are Latinos. And sometimes, I'll go into Asian communities and Asians don't care as much because they believe Asians are not being targeted. Now, I know a lot of Asians are targeted. In fact, when I go into these immigration detention centers, I'm typically the only attorney that speaks Mandarin. And so I speak to all the Mandarin speaking people who have been targeted, and there's always a lot of them. But what I find to be really useful when talking to Asians about the raids right now and why they should care is making it about defending the Constitution. I talk about how the future of Asian Americans in this country is really at risk. We've been discriminated against and put into these camps in the past, like Japanese Americans were in World War II. And it is very likely that we would be faced with that question again. I think in the next decade or so, the American public will be asked the question, what do we do with all of these Chinese Americans in our country? Are they spies? Do we treat them like we treated Japanese Americans in World War II, or do we do something different? That question will be asked. And so for me, to keep our community safe, we absolutely have to defend the Constitution. We have to defend civil rights. Right now, it is a lot of Latinos who are being taken, and we need to speak up now so that when we are the ones who are under attack, then other folks are there to speak up for us. So that's one way I try to address it. I think, there are obviously a lot of issues that are very specific to Asian Americans, but there are also a ton of issues that are relevant to everybody. One thing we talk about often is the need to create a US that works for the middle class and work for working people in our country. Healthcare, education, housing, all of these things have gotten vastly too expensive, and talking about how to bring down the cost of these things, how to make sure our society works for regular people instead of corrupt politicians and the companies that sponsor them. That is something that every community finds a lot of resonance to. But good luck with your race. That's so exciting.
Thank you.
That's very interesting. It's good to know that another Chinese American, Gen Z Chinese American, is running for office. That's a good thing to know. We'll go to the next person. Megan, you can say your question now.
Hi, yeah. So I'm also a leader in TYCon. Outside of that, I organized this local poetry group in LA, and my parents were also at Tsinghua in 1989. So I thought there's a lot of interesting parallels there. I have two questions. I'll ask the first and then hopefully the second after, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the first one, you mentioned impactful change being conducted through like shifting these communities' mindsets as like one of the primary forces of actual sustainable change. So for those who are not involved in government, where do you recommend stepping up into leadership to amplify the shift that people like you are advocating for?
There are a million ways, right? Protesting, joining rapid response networks, organizing, helping your union, all of these things are amazing. There really is no like one organization. There are thousands, hundreds of thousands of organizations around the country that are doing great work. What I think folks, especially who are still in college, can really do to make themselves more effective is to learn how to tell stories. That's what I find to be the most powerful way of changing people's hearts and minds. People's hearts and minds are not changed by data. They're not changed by lectures. They're changed by stories, right? When I tell you the story of my grandma and being not let into these immigration detention centers, it really helps visualize the human impact, right? When I tell you the story of Ken, whose tent got taken away and I never saw him again, right? That shows the human impact of these encampment sweeps that happen in California. So in college, I got a minor in creative writing where I learned how to do storytelling. And creative writing and creative storytelling is very different than the kind of writing that is typically taught in college. In college, they teach you how to write very effectively, very efficiently, but they don't teach you how to write very creatively. They don't teach you how to tell stories. And I think that's a real shame. So if you have a creative writing class at your college, take that. When I was in law school, I also took a class on speech writing. It was taught by a former speechwriter for Obama. Again, absolutely fundamental to what I'm able to do now. I think those two classes, the creative writing classes I took and speech writing, those maybe 6 classes that I took were more important to me and what I'm doing now than every other class I've taken combined.
Amazing. Yeah, that's amazing to hear. I'm actually hosting like a Lunar New Year event later today, and I was thinking of kind of telling my story, Chinese American experience. So I think I'll work on that after this.
I'll
Okay,
give
and
some
then
quick storytelling tips
okay, bet.
that really guide me. The first is a story. We have an equation for stories. It's desire plus danger equals drama. Okay, so the main character has to want something. There has to be danger getting in the way, and when you put those things together, you get drama. The more the character desires that thing, or the bigger the danger, then the more drama you have. So that's one thing to keep in mind for stories. The number two is I would really start with a story hook. And a hook, right? We talk about it all the time. What I find to be the most effective hooks are what's called a story gap, where you tell a part of a story, but you leave it off so people don't know what's going to happen, right? And the desire to find out what happens, that's really great for keeping people engaged.
Amazing. Thank you. Okay, the second question, again, because a couple of us here do work in TYCon for the Gen2 community, and one of the active conversations is how can we get this community more involved in, these public service, in like engaging in government and all of that. I guess so in that context, and then the explicit question is, when working to redefine this Chinese American identity here, how would you say like your Chinese background has impacted your understanding between like this tension between China and America? And then where do you see our role as a community in building the future? Hopefully that was clear.
Yeah, no, it is clear. Definitely a very good question. Yeah, I mean, my identity as a Chinese American, the relationship I have with China, those are all still open questions for me. I think every few years, the way I think about these things changes and become more nuanced than before. And I think that's the way it should be because it does not benefit us to feed into any of the narratives, any of the millions of narratives that are floating around between the US China and US China relations. For me, things are a lot more complicated. So I encourage you all to find your own answer as well. And I think that will be better than whatever the media tries to tell us. Now, in terms of what the role of our community is, I think of us as, hopefully not the same future, definitely not to the same extent, but in some ways similar to Jewish folks, in Europe in the 1930s, in that we are a minority in the country, but a lot of us are doing very well, going to great schools, really wealthy, but we don't have a lot of political power. And as someone who studied history, I can tell you that what a part of the reason that the Holocaust happened is the feeling that the economy was not working for people, especially in Germany, but throughout the whole world during the Great Depression, right? The economy was not working, and some folks took advantage of that and found a community to blame. And in the 1930s, that was the Jewish community. And right now in the US, what we see is wages have not kept up with prices for the last 50 years. Since the 1980s, Americans have gotten poorer and poorer. And I think that's why you see Trump. I think that's why immigrant communities are under attack, because they are an easy target to blame for what's happening in the country. And Chinese people could very easily be rolled up into that as relations between China and the US get worse. And I think what's really important for our community is one, defending civil rights, defending the Constitution, defending other communities when they come under attack, but two, advancing an alternative vision, which is yes, the economy is not working, but the reason it's not working is not because of minorities. The reason it's not working is not because of immigrants. The reason it's not working is because some of these corporations and these PACs have way too much power in our society. Too much of our money is going into for-profit prisons. Too much of our money is going into the housing developers who are buying up entire neighborhoods. Too much of our money is going to Israel who are bombing children. And in Israel, they have free education, they have free healthcare. We don't have that here in the US. So why are we giving billions of dollars to Israel when they're also being accused of committing genocide, right? That is the fundamental thing that needs to change in our country for our economy to recover, for our economy to work for regular people. That's the kind of change I'm fighting for in my race for lieutenant governor. And I hope you all will also fight for that change.
Thank you.
All right, due to time constraints, we're going to take two more questions. So our next question will be Mark, and our last question will be from Jason. So Mark, the floor is yours.
Hello, I thought your last answer was really interesting. And I guess what stood out to me is, I myself, I'm originally from Russia. And a lot of the time, that's something that, like, when people say, sort of, where are you from? A lot of the time, I'll just say Irvine, because there's a level to where, like, with the Russian relationship with America, obviously, I feel like that's just a topic I'd want to, like, avoid entirely when meeting someone for the first time. And my question would be, obviously, where there's, I guess, a similar level of like, which a lot of people see China as like an adversary. How do you deal with that where you might be like grouped or you feel like that's something you have to talk about immediately?
Yeah. I think, hey, I totally, I'm never going to judge someone, right, for not avoiding that conversation. Sometimes I avoid that conversation. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, we're not going to be able to hide who we are. So I think it is important that we own that and we change the way people feel about that. Because, I like to say that, like, when they came after Japanese Americans in World War II, they didn't care if someone was a Democrat or a Republican. They just cared that they were Japanese Americans. That's very much the same thing here. It doesn't matter what our politics are. It doesn't matter how much we try to change how we look or how we speak. We're never going to be able to hide from the fact that we have that Chinese heritage. And so organizing and building power in our communities to keep us safe, that is absolutely critical.
Thank you for your answer. I think we'll transition just to the last question due to time. Thank you.
All right, Jason, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. So my question is, given the current state of the economy, the politics where the government is really, really oppressive against immigrants, and overall, the influence of Chinese Americans and everybody is really, really low. For example, if you ran against a white guy with the same background, they would win. How do you feel about this? What motivates you to keep going, sticking to your values? And also, do you think that the situation for immigrants and Chinese Americans has improved recently, or is it going on a downwards trend? And what about the long run?
Yeah, I remember right before Trump took office the second time, the attorneys on my team and the organizers on my team, we sat together and we planned how to fight against that. And people who were on the team in 2016 and 2017 spoke up and they talked about how much they worked, how they were working 100 hours a week, how when you logged on to your laptop at midnight, everyone else was online and everybody was working. And it was really a sad moment for the team because I think we all collectively realized that despite all of those hundreds of hours of working, that 8 years later, the way the country sees immigrants is worse. And so all of that work, all of those lawsuits they filed, it didn't change people's hearts and minds. And that's why we have Trump again. So I think that is a huge focus of mine is the work to change people's hearts and minds. I also think we have to be honest about why we have Trump again. These for-profit immigration detention centers that I talk so much about, they make billions of dollars from taxpayers. For every single immigrant in there, they charge anywhere from $100,000 to millions of dollars per immigrant. So they're making a ton from taxpayers. And then they donate millions of dollars into our political process to elect politicians who will keep on building these prisons and funding these prisons. And they actually donate about an equal amount to Republicans and Democrats. And I think that is such a great example that explains why we have Trump. Because on the one hand, you have Republicans who are blaming immigrants for everything wrong with this country. And on the other hand, you have Democrats who are fighting with an arm tied behind their back. On one hand, they're campaigning against Trump. And with the other hand, they're taking checks from the same corporations that are brutalizing immigrants. And it bleeds into other fields too. A big topic in the 2024 election was why housing prices were so expensive. And the Republicans were talking so much about how immigrants are the reason housing is expensive. And that's not true, right? Farm workers and people making minimum wage are not out competing Americans for homes. The people who are out competing Americans for homes are the corporate landlords. Last quarter, a third of all homes sold in our country was bought by investor landlords. So they are outbidding regular Americans and buying up all the homes. That's why homes are expensive. It would have been so easy for the Democratic Party to say immigrants are not the reason housing is more expensive. It is the corporate landlords. And by the way, you know who's a really bad corporate landlord? Donald Trump, who treats his tenants like shit. But they never said that. And the reason they couldn't say that is because these same corporate landlords are giving the Democratic Party tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars. And so I think to fix the politics in our country, to make sure we have an economy that works for everybody, and to keep immigrant families safe, all these things stem from one change that we need to make, which is to get the corruption and to get the money out of politics, make this country work for regular people.
Thank you, Oliver. I know, at least personally, I feel like the Q&A was the most valuable, and it was really interesting to hear everything you had to say. One thing I'll definitely be taking away is like the art of storytelling. Maybe I'll go take some creative writing classes next semester. But anyways, that concludes our webinar for February. I want to say thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you for your really insightful and nuanced questions and answers. I hope people are feeling inspired or learned something today. Our next webinar will be taking place in the end of March. Just to plug it, we're going to be exploring a little shift, the consulting space. So private, public sector, a little bit of range. And I will be sending out a follow-up email to everyone who registered or RSVP'd. If you didn't, please put your email in the chat and I will send it out to you, where I'll be just sending links about ways to get involved with TYCon, register for upcoming webinars, but also ways to get involved with Oliver's campaign and more information on the organizations he started. If you have any questions or feedback, also ideas for future webinar topics, please feel free to reach out to me as well. So without further ado, thank you everyone again. Thank you, Oliver, for joining us today, and have a great rest of your weekend.
Thanks. Tatiana, I see the question about getting in touch. Feel free to send my email out to folks.
Okay, absolutely. I will also put that in the recap.